The framers of our Constitution were obsessed with the idea of independence. And by which I don't mean the independence of 1776. I mean the independence that began to be the center of their obsession by about 1785. For by 1785, our framers began to recognize that America was a failure, that a certain corruption had spread itself through our society, and a corruption that came from a lack of independence. A lack of independence meaning a dependence that was increasingly defining how representatives connected to their government. They were dependents. They depended on influences that were not influences that allowed them to be focused on the public good. As Jefferson described it, the dependent is one that begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tool for the designs of ambition. It is what government had become, and they sought non-dependent representatives, independent representatives, who could seek the right answer for the right reason, and their common aim was institutions, constitutions, against that improper dependence for a proper dependence, meaning dependence upon the people alone. Now, they failed in that, at least with respect to this institution of our government. They failed. The 19th century was a cesspool of corruption. Here's Daniel Webster, who at the time that he served in Congress, a Congress voting on the status of the Bank of the United States, was employed by the Bank of the United States. Here's a letter he wrote to the bank. "If it be wished that my relation to the bank be continued, it may be well to send me the usual retainer." Bribery was not even a crime in Congress until 1853. The period was a period where the idea of dependence on external resources to feather your nest was natural. The 20th century was much better in that respect, but it suffered a corruption of a different form, a dependency of a different form. Not money to feather the nest of a representative, people like Randy Duke, is really the exception, and Jack Abramoff no longer rules. The dependency that existed in the 20th century was a dependency on money to secure tenure, and not the tenure at a place like Harvard, tenure at a place like this. A constant attention to money, and the money necessary to be reelected. Somewhere between 30 to 70% of their time as representatives focused on this one question: how do I get the money to come back here? A sixth sense they develop to be aware of exactly how their votes might affect the opportunity to raise money. Their second job, raising money to go back to Congress, became their first job. No Congress in the history of our Congress has worked less than this Congress, where work means doing the job of legislating as opposed to the job of raising money to come back to Congress. And that feeds the dependency that defines this generation. Now, that dependency has costs. It has costs for our democracy. From the right, it has a cost that the right needs to focus on much more. Think, for example, about this story. This is the Communications Act. It has 6 separate titles. Title 2 regulates something called telecom telephones. Title 6 regulates cable. Radically different regulatory regimes. 1994, Al Gore suggested that we take the difference in these regulatory regimes as it relates to the internet and unite them. He wanted to create Title 7. Title 7 would take DSL and cable and put it under one head, but the key defining feature of Title VII was that it would deregulate internet service. His team took this idea to Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill said, hell no. How are we going to raise money from the telecoms if we deregulate them? Now, people on the right need to increasingly recognize the architecture of government here, this kind of extortion that gets built into government as government reaches as far as it needs for the purpose of facilitating raising money to run elections. And the question for the right has got to be, how much extortion-enabling regulation is there out there? How much does it define or describe what our government is? But the harm here is not just from the perspective of the right. There's a harm that the right and the left both understand. This is the harm that this dependency does as it queers or bends the government to get the wrong answer to fundamental questions. Not hard questions, easy questions. So, for example, I spent about a decade of my life fighting one set of these questions. It was a fight that began around October 27th, 1998. Inspired by this man, Sonny Bono. Sonny Bono was the namesake for this statute, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, a statute which extended the term of existing and future copyrights by 20 years. Existing copyrights and future copyrights. Now, there was a policy behind this statute, and the question was, how well did that policy relate to the policy of copyright law? Which, of course, is to create incentives to produce something new. And of course, that policy then can be evaluated in relation to this statute. And as it was evaluated, the question Congress should have been asking was, did this extension of existing copyrights advance the public good? Well, this man, no lefty, a guy named Milton Friedman, analyzed this question. He agreed to join a brief in the Supreme Court attacking this statute. He said he would only join the brief if the word no-brainer existed in the brief somewhere, because so clear, even to this person from the right, was it that such an extension of copyright could make no sense of public policy at all, but apparently there were no brains here when this statute was passed. Here's an easy public policy question Congress just gets wrong. Or think about another area, increasingly a focus of my work, nutrition. There's a consensus among those who know something about this, that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. 2003, the World Health Organization decided it would try to do something about this. So it launched a standard to say that we should get no more than 10% of our daily caloric intake from added sugar. Well, the sugar industry, they have this sweet little logo here, they went ballistic. There they are, going ballistic. They got members in Congress to threaten to withdraw funding from the WHO if it didn't back down from its ridiculous proposition that no more than 10% of our daily caloric intake come from sugar. Here's a letter signed by Senator Larry Craig demanding that they back down from this absurd position. They wanted the government and the World Health Organization to take position that we should have 25% of our daily caloric intake come from sugar. Well, the World Health Organization didn't back down, but our government did. 2003, the Food Nutrition Board promulgated standards saying 25% of your daily caloric intake should come from sugar. So here's a balanced diet according to the United States government. You can start with Fruit Loops or M&Ms for breakfast, a glass of milk, cheeseburger for lunch, pepperoni pizza, indeed 3 slices of pepperoni pizza for dinner, and sugar cookies for dessert. That's a balanced diet, according to our government. This is, again, easy public policy question the government just gets wrong. Or most fundamentally, think about global warming, right? Of course, we all now know what the consensus had been for many years, that we're doing it. As Al Gore states it, the debate's over. There are 5 points in the consensus. Number 1, global warming is real. Number 2, we human beings are mainly responsible. Number 3, consequences are very bad. Number 4, we need to fix it quickly. And number 5, it's not too late. They decided they'd try to evaluate this consensus by studying the view among scientists. So they collected 1,000 journals from peer-reviewed, 1,000 articles from peer-reviewed journals between the period 1993 and 2003. Discovered that 0%, exactly 0, questioned this basic consensus. Then they decided to study the same question in popular media, looking at 600 articles randomly selected between 1988 and 2002. They discovered that 53% questioned the basic consensus. That 53%, of course, is the product of the extraordinarily well-funded junk science that had been promulgated in the public sphere about the questions of global warming, that complemented the efforts by politicians to delay our government focusing on this issue for at least 10 years, maybe the critical 10 years that were the difference between being able to solve this problem or not. Once again, easy public policy question which we just get wrong. Now, the point in all of these cases, these easy cases that government gets wrong, cases not just about esoteric matters like whether Mickey Mouse should be free, but core questions, the most important questions that our government faces, that our government gets wrong. It gets wrong because of this dependency upon money. But this point, from the left and the right, I think is missing the point. Because the problem of money in politics is not the problem of big government, which is the focus of the right. It's not the problem of the wrong answers to important public policy questions, which both the right and the left worry about. The real problem is as it relates to trust in our government, in an obvious way. So here's an obvious example. This is advertisement for a drug called Alteplase. The Activice is the brand name for it. This is a drug that deals with something we used to call strokes. The industry now calls it brain attacks. In 1998, the American Heart Association did a study of this drug. This conclusion was to support the drug as safe and effective, but there was a dissent. But when they published the report in 2000, the dissent was erased. Indeed, the name of the doctor was removed from the list of those who had reviewed the drug. And then the British Medical Journal discovered that the company who produced the drug, Genentech, had given the AHA $11 million, raising obvious questions. As the journalist put it, this recommendation may have been made in the true spirit of unbiased scientific inquiry, but the appearance of dispassionate analysis was eroded by large donations from a drug company. The point is not that they necessarily got the conclusion wrong. It is that money on the table eroded any trust that people were going to have in the conclusion that they reached. Now compare that obvious point with the same point in the context of politics. You might have heard of this battle recently about telco immunity, whether we're going to grant to telephone companies immunity for participating with the Bush administration in violating civil rights of all of us as they watched what we said on telephones and the internet, an immunity which hasn't been granted to soldiers, as we see from the film that started this proceeding. In March of this year, the US House voted on this immunity. They voted it down. Then 3 months later, in June, the same House voted it up. 94 Democrats changed their vote between those two votes. There's only one Republican who voted against immunity, so there's not really a good sample here to study. But Democrats who opposed the immunity, 94 changed their vote. Why did they change their vote? Well, an organization on whose board I sit proudly, called maplight.org, within a couple hours was able to demonstrate that the Democrats who changed their vote had received almost twice the amount of money in contributions from telco companies from the Democrats who did not change their vote, raising the question of why they changed their vote, suggesting because of the money. Now, of course, they say it's not about the money, but the point we need to recognize is, what do we expect the public to believe here? Again, maybe not necessarily because of the money, but the money in this equation erodes the trust we're going to have in this institution. Both stories here are about the same dynamic, about the conditions for trust, about how money destroys the conditions for trust. It destroys the possibility of trust, how it has destroyed the possibility of us trusting this institution. In this district, 88% of people believe money buys results in Congress. And astonishingly, as reported just last week now, nationwide, for the first time in America's history, the number of people who believe government, Congress, is doing a good job is in the single digits. 9% of America think Congress is doing a good job. And what the hell do we expect? We can't trust this institution. We won't trust this institution. We won't have faith in this institution until we can believe, as we all want to believe, that they got what they got wrong, either because they were stupid or biased, or there were more Republicans than Democrats or Democrats than Republicans, but not because of the money here. That's the test we will have in this evaluation. Now, our framers were obsessed with independence. Two of the institutions which they created, the executive and judicial branch, should be proud that they've achieved something of the independence which the framers envisioned for them. One of the institutions here has been an unbelievable failure. And the point to recognize is, as it fails, democracy fails. Because we begin to shift power to presidents and courts as our Congress fails. And presidents are monarchical regardless of the party. It's Bill Clinton and George Bush who want to increase the power of the presidency. And courts are not democratic organizations, not just because they're now populated by people from the right. They shift power away from the people. That's the consequence of this dependency. We need to fix this dependency. This is what Joe Trippi and I were thinking when we launched a project which we launched a couple months ago called the Change Congress Movement. And you can find more about this there. But I think the key that we need to recognize the fix that's necessary here is to recognize this problem as a problem we're familiar with, a problem of dependency. So think about the dependent we know best in our life. There's not one of you who hasn't been hurt by, or nor somebody who was hurt by, or maybe yourself hurt somebody because of the dependency of alcoholism. I know this in my own family, extraordinarily destructive power of this dependency. So think about the alcoholic and the problems he might be facing. He might be losing his family, his job, his liver. But what we all know is he will not solve any of those problems until he solves his alcoholism first. So it's not that that's the most important problem in his life. It's just the first problem he needs to solve. And so too with us. There's no end to the problems that we as a nation need to solve, extraordinarily significant problems from global warming to Iraq, to the economy, to healthcare, to education, broadband growth, even copyright policy. But we won't address these problems sensibly until we solve this first problem first. Now, as we look with pride, rightful pride, upon the promise that we all bring to this ideal of democracy, we should recognize, we should be embarrassed by how astonishing it is that we all think it impossible right now to solve this dependency, our first problem first. How impossible that sounds. And until we make that solution possible, the very possibility of democracy in this, the inspiration for democracy around the world, will be lost. Thank you very much.